I want to give you an overview of where travel and tourism sits in relation to today's post-Paris Agreement climate world. This lecture is divided into two parts. In the first, I'll discuss the prologue, how climate change and tourism decisions have interacted in the past few decades. And in the second, we'll watch a video on the Glasgow Declaration made for a recent ETC SunX training course. The Glasgow Declaration, made in November of last year, is tourism's most significant intersect with the global UN climate response system to date, and therefore it has enormous significance going forward. And not the least because so many organizations have used its broad general approach to net zero carbon in 2050 as a baseline for their own activity. But first, let's go back 20 years to Djerba in Tunisia, which is really the starting point. And bear in mind, the global climate response mechanism had really started 10 years before that at the Rio Earth Summit. 2003 saw the first UNWTO organized conference on climate change and tourism. It was initiated with WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, because of the weather dimension, and UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, because of the Sustainable Development and Environmental Management dimension. At that time, UNWTO had only just become a part of the UN, and hence it was suddenly inside the tent rather than outside, and the travel and tourism sector had a foothold inside the tent. At Djerba, there were more than 150 participants from 42 countries and 6 international organizations. And there were 26 specific presentations on the interrelation of climate change and tourism. The conference also looked at theme areas like water, coastal management, and island destinations, as well as mountain areas. It looked at both policy and mitigation issues, policy in terms of carbon reduction and adaptation, resilience to the impact of climate change. From the conference came yet another declaration. The Djerba Declaration recognizes that climate change impacts are already occurring at some tourism destinations, and that the effects are expected to spread in the future. Consequently, there is an identified need for travel and tourism to start to take action, both in terms of resilience to climate change and in terms of reduction of polluting gases. It includes a series of recommendations for international organizations, governments, and private sector agencies for collaborative actions at international, national, and local destination levels. Francesco Frangiali, who was then the UNWTO Secretary General, and was really the instigator of tourism becoming involved with climate change, because he wore another hat as the mayor of a small French mountain village, Morgine, and he had seen already the impacts of lower snowfalls, shorter skiing seasons, and a consequent threat of reduced tourists and reduced tourist expenditure for his community. He said, quote, "The Djerba conference fulfilled perfectly its main purposes, bringing together officials, researchers, experts, and operators involved in the two major fields of climate change and tourism, raising awareness on the specific interrelations and proposing some areas of cooperation for further action." And he concluded that UNWTO will follow up the activities at various levels, including to create a clearinghouse mechanism to disseminate research results and know-how on this subject internationally. And I repeat, it's fair to say that UNWTO generally, and Francesco specifically, were the leaders in this area. No other organization had it on its radar screen. And the only other likely organization, WTTC, had scaled down its green activities around 1999, when there had been internal discussions as to whether there should be an emphasis on growth and economic results or on sustainability. And the growth and economic results initiatives won out. And then in 2007, 4 years later, UNWTO took an even bigger step with its Davos Climate and Tourism Conference. And I had the privilege of organizing and moderating that event as Assistant Secretary General of UNWTO in those days. It was a huge step forward from Djerba. The outside environment had already begun to put more emphasis on climate change. It had become a strong issue at a political level, and Davos had some 450 delegates and 22 international organizations present. It was held in the conference center that the World Economic Forum holds its annual meetings. And it was, in fact, the first time that the forum and Klaus Schwab, the president, had allowed any other group to step into the Davos arena. It was a significant achievement to raise the profile into that framework. Most of the industry advocacy organizations participated at a top level. It included airline and cruise representatives from IATA and CLIA, activities which are technically not covered by the UN Climate Convention, and as we'll see later, are dealt with under separate international agreements, the Chicago Convention of 1944 for aviation, and the International Maritime Agreements of 1948 in the case of shipping. It included a major tourism and climate science study led by Professor Daniel Scott that concluded that tourism accounted for 5% of global greenhouse gas. This was the first time such a study had been undertaken. 8 international experts were brought together, and it was clear at the time that the focus on tourism had begun to become a significant component of the overall global approach to assessing greenhouse gases. Transport was seen to represent 40% of that 5%, i.e. 2% of the total. So aviation, which was a significant part of transport, maybe half of it, was only at that stage seen as 1 to 1.5% of greenhouse gas production. The Davos Declaration, which we described as an ongoing process, not just as a declaration, was developed with an eye on the forthcoming 2007 COP13 in Bali. It introduced the idea that there was not a triple bottom line of economic, social, and environmental determinants, but a quadruple bottom line, that climate was not a subset of any of those three elements, but of all of them, and was in fact a determinant on its own. So we talked about the quadruple bottom line. It was a comprehensive approach. It covered hospitality, transport, and other travel service providers. It included more than 20 specific actions for follow-up, assigned to individual subsectors of the travel and tourism system, and with a role for UNWTO to act as a focal point for future and continuous work in this area. Sadly, there was little robust follow-up, although UNWTO did issue a report. It's in your Thinkific material, and presented it to a ministerial session in London. To be honest with you, it was what Greta Thunberg called blah, blah, blah. It was publicity, it was marketing, it was promotion. I seem to recall that Richard Quest was the of CNN, was the kind of host and compere of the activity. But in retrospect, it was a major lost opportunity. UNWTO went on to present the Davos Declaration in Bali. Again, it was not widely recognized. Francesco Frangeli actually made the presentation in a video interjection from a side room rather than in front of all the delegates. But it was the first formal engagement of the sector in the UNFCCC process. And since that time, the organization has steadily increased its involvement, periodically producing updates on the Davos process, again, without actively implementing the subcomponents and the recommendations in the declaration. Here we're going to see a couple of short videos we made for the Copenhagen COP in 2009 with the Sri Lankan platinum disc singer Alston Koch, including a kids version.
The world, with all its wonders, gives us pain without the rain. Have you ever stopped to wonder, could we take this climate change in a land just like no other, where the mountains reach the seas? We must try to help each other make the change for the world to see. Deep inside there's a feeling of the way it used to be, and if we all get together, make the change, don't let it be. In a land just like no other, there's a place for you and me. We will try to help each other. We will change for the world to see. Did you ever know why the birds just flew away, or why the leopard left his tree? Why the mountains keep falling to the ground when the wind just blew them all away? If the world with all its wonders gives us pain without the rain, have you ever stopped to wonder, could we take this climate change? Could we take this climate change? Did you ever know why the birds just flew away, or why the leopard left his tree? Why the mountains keep falling to the ground when the wind just blew them all away? If the world with all its wonders gives us pain without the rain, have you ever stopped to wonder, could we take this climate change? Could we take this climate change?
After 2009, activities quietened down somewhat. There was a general global disappointment with the outcomes of Copenhagen. They had anticipated a deal which fell through at the last minute because China and the United States were unable to reach an agreement on specific actions and a global approach. President Obama himself was there, but at the end, they had to go away without such an agreement. And in the tourism sector, the focus was more at the national level. administrations working to implement UN climate agreements under a climate ministry framework, and tourism kind of looking to find its place in this process. UNWTO established a network of observatories to track these local change impacts. There have also been specific updates on the Davos Declaration process and discussions at various ministerial meetings, including the T20, a shadow G20 group of tourism ministers, to provide input to G20 discussions on these issues and related other economic policy issues. But these have all been advocacy initiatives rather than any attempt to implement programs to reduce or respond to the impacts of climate change. Finally, in looking at UNWTO, there was a high-level session at the Madrid COP in 2018 when UNWTO produced a significant report with the International Transport Forum that focused particularly around the transport impacts. It showed at that time that tourism was expected to account for 5.3% of all man-made CO2 emissions by 2030. Tourism transport-related initiatives. And that was up from an estimate of 5% in 2016, but not a particularly huge increase over a 15-year period. It does show a significant increase from the 2% of transport-related tourism carbon emissions identified back in the 2007 baseline report in Davos. UNWTO has played an increasingly important tourism leading edge in the UN system's approach to climate change, as one would imagine after it joined the UN in 2003. But it hasn't been the only one in a sector as fragmented as tourism. WTTC, as an industry lead organization, and now a self-declared, quote, authority, unquote, has shown a growing interest. It has covered the climate issue way back in my day, in the 1990s, in its Agenda 21 for travel and tourism. But to be honest, it was not a mainstream element. Rather, it was a green, sustainable subset and seen in the context of that emerging triple bottom line. WTTC has recently emphasized the importance of this issue in producing a roadmap to net zero developed with the UN Environment Programme and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and Accenture Consultancy. It's a comprehensive paper. It is quite closely aligned to the concept of the Science-Based Targets Initiative out of the United States, with very, very intricate and deep measurement of the three Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 greenhouse gases that are identified. It's the kind of thing that is very important to big companies who have sustainability teams and who hire groups like Accenture to write their sustainability reports. It does not, in my view, deal adequately with the 80 to 90% of small and medium enterprise that make up the basis of the tourism sector and who would not themselves be either willing or capable of going into climate response at that same level. The WTTC roadmap provides guidelines and recommendation to help travel and tourism businesses get to net zero in 2050. And it provides climate action and emission reduction approaches for different subsectors within the industry. It sets out the challenges ahead and describes how the travel and tourism sector could decarbonize to reach net zero by 2050. And maybe this is just a moment for an aside on the nature of the net zero issue. I believe that in order to shift our global society towards a long-term goal of 2050, 30 years into the future, where a lot of the response mechanisms will come from technologies which are just on the drawing board now, will take decades to develop, to implement, and to move to scale. So the coalitions, and it was a number of coalitions, who came together in the 2015 to 2021 period, had to find a way to draw as many people in as possible to create a global response network. And to do this, they had to have a lowest common denominator approach, where you could bring in the really keen and active players on one side, and those people who kind of didn't want to do it, but felt they had to, either because it was coming from shareholders or from some sort of corporate social responsibility vision, or because they genuinely believed there was a broad-scale consumer movement towards that. But you had a pretty broad span of opinions on how and when and whether tourism should get deeply involved in issues which were outside its normal area of review, handled by a different ministry, environment and climate ministries, and was likely to increase your costs as the companies thought, and certainly increase your regulatory burden. So something as vague and nebulous as net carbon 2050 could bring everybody in. And people could say, we're going to find new technologies that will allow us to achieve that, such as carbon capture, sucking carbon out of the air and burying it in the ground. And we'll pay for that to compensate for the emissions that we're producing. It could be a market-based mechanism where people sell shares in carbon reduction companies and produce sustainable aviation fuel, for example, which is designed to reduce the airlines' impact in terms of greenhouse gases. It could be planting of trees. It could be providing water to villages in least developed countries. That's the net bit. You keep producing your emissions and you find ways to compensate for that through some other mechanism. And that's the net. Government may choose to tax carbon to make it more difficult for you to keep using more and more. And they may provide incentives to you in the form of carbon credits, so that you have some credits to use inside a system where they are clamping down on the quantity of carbon that can be produced. A whole range and raft of issues are covered by this magic word net zero. And from the perspective of bringing everybody in, it's a good approach. But from the perspective of putting pressure on people to reduce their emissions, it is not a good approach. In many respects, and I think I mentioned this in the first lecture, it's the kind of cop-out that says, I'm going to give up smoking and I'll pay somebody in Africa to stop smoking, but I'll keep doing 2 or 3 packs a day. And we'll have more discussion on this as we go forward. We can touch on it in our discussion at the end of this lecture. I want to look now briefly at another area which is vitally important, and yet which isn't covered in the UNFCCC framework. And here I'm talking about aviation and cruises. They operate outside that framework under the 1944 Chicago Convention for Aviation and the ICAO governmental regime, and the 1948 International Maritime Convention for Shipping and the International Maritime Organization as the responsible governing agency. What is noteworthy is that the industry advocacy organizations have been increasingly engaged in recent years, particularly for airlines, and particularly after Greta Thunberg's inspired no-fly campaign, and which galvanized action, intensified action by the aviation sector. IATA and its broader offshoot ATAG were the airline lead entities, and the ACI, the Airport Council International, representing airports for aviation. And on the shipping side, an organization called CLIA, Cruise Lines International, based out of Florida, because 75% of the cruise operations in the world are owned by companies out of Florida. All of these organizations, IATA, CLIA, ATAG, have developed net zero 2050 strategies. By far the most detailed and most significant has come from IATA. IATA developed a 4-pillar strategy as far back as 2009, before the Copenhagen COP, and promoted this extensively for the next decade. It was developed with McKinsey, and it was successfully integrated into international organization policies, and most notably in ICAO, and particularly through the Air Transport Action Group, which is a dedicated group focused on climate and sustainability issues, and which was launched by IATA, but brought in many other aviation-related organizations, aircraft manufacturers, engine manufacturers, air traffic control authorities, into a coalition focused around climate response. IATA called for carbon neutrality, and I say carbon, not greenhouse gases, through technology development, new aircraft types, new engine types, through infrastructure, shortening of air routes, making planes fly more directly so they use less fuel, and the technology associated with a better air traffic control system. Operations, procedures that the airlines themselves could use in order to reduce fuel on their approaches, reduce fuel on the ground, have electric tugs to push them out to runways and pull them in instead of fossil fuel propelled tugs, and a whole host of those kind of detailed issues, and market-based measures, as I mentioned before. Systems which allowed carbon trading, which allowed offsetting, which ultimately brought in a global offsetting and reduction system, CORSIA, inside ICAO, which meant that everybody would have to follow the same system worldwide. And thus, after 10 years of very intensive positioning and lobbying, this has now evolved into its net zero commitment, which was approved by all IATA airlines in Doha earlier this year and brought into ICAO's own mechanisms at its recent assembly in Montreal a couple of months ago. Very, very focused, very intensive, and very successful approach by IATA. Number one, to link with the UNFCCC, but outside, under the governance of ICAO. And number two, to integrate into ICAO its own strategic objectives. Now, way behind this, but following a very similar approach, is CLIA, representing the cruise lines. And I think basically they have watched what IATA was doing and to a large extent mirrored it for cruise ships, which have a notoriously questionable reputation in terms of their pollution and environmental management, waste disposal, and carbon emission, with the increasingly large cruise ships, 10,000 cabin cruise ships, which are being built. CLIA's 2022 Global Cruise Industry Environmental Technologies and Practices report, that was not developed by marketing people, seeks to show progress towards achieving the industry's vision of net zero carbon cruising globally by 2050. So there you see the net zero and the 2050 is attractive to the industry organizations. It's not business as usual, but I've described it elsewhere as business almost as usual. As a perfect example, a net zero 2030 target can include 50% of offsets and increasing emissions rather than reducing ones. So there's a lot of question marks around this. But the cruise ships had also a range of activities, not unlike IATA's 4 pillars. They had 4 of their own. Shoreside power capability, so they wouldn't have to generate the electricity when they were tethered. They could plug in to shore-based, increasingly green electricity. Use of liquefied natural gas, LNG fuel, which of course was developed and promoted in a huge way by BP and other fossil fuel companies. Exhaust gas cleaning systems. In other words, stop the carbon before it hits the atmosphere. And finally, advanced wastewater treatment systems, where they were able to make sure that the water and the waste water used on the ship was recycled in appropriate ways that it did not pollute. All of this development took place and coalesced before the 2021 COP in Glasgow and the tourism-specific Glasgow Declaration. And here I'm going to pause and share a video on this subject, which I gave to a recent ETC SunX climate-friendly travel induction course. And the video goes into more depth than I otherwise would be doing in this lecture. What I want to do now is to look at the Glasgow Declaration, which was developed at COP26 last year by a cluster of stakeholders led by UNWTO and UNEP, who've been working in this area together for at least the past decade, and which lays out net zero carbon targets for travel and tourism. Was a launch signatory, pointing out at that time it does not go far enough, fast enough, and identifying zero greenhouse gas by 2050, rather than the more nebulous net zero carbon, which the Glasgow Declaration focuses on. I make no apology for my repeated insistence on this point. This is a code red crisis, not a grand marketing campaign or an ego trip. It's simply our belief at SunX Malta that we have to have an absolutely committed and ultra serious approach to what everybody calls a code red crisis, and then moves on to the next thing. The Glasgow Declaration has 5 pathways for transformation, and I'm going to offer some brief perspective on each. Pathway number 1 is to measure. This is one of the critical areas, with dozens of different systems to cover direct, indirect, and induced impacts of carbon and greenhouse gas pollution. What works for a big hotel chain may not for a small travel agent. Our approach at SunX Malta, like most of our actions, is to encourage the principle and to leave the type of methodology to the operator. We understand that the UNFCCC and others are pushing for the toughest systems to become a standard. Inside the organizers of the Glasgow Declaration, there is a predilection for the science-based targets, driven by some people who are using science-based targets effectively in the industry, like Intrepid. But this is not for everyone. This is a very high quality performance standard, probably needs high cost consultants to help put the framework together for any company, and is simply out of the reach of the smallest. And in our view, other people have developed effective standards which are applicable to different situations and different circumstances. And we see our role as to be able to identify the whole variety of systems, and there'll be new ones all the time. We started out with one called Planet 21 in Latin America over 4 years ago. There are countless carbon calculators. ICAO has an aviation calculator. IATA has just released an aviation calculator. You can find an aviation calculator from individual airlines. So rather than try to force everybody into one box, we'd rather educate people to see the importance of it. And I want to make one side comment here on the whole question of the carbon footprint. Never, ever, ever forget that the carbon footprint is a concept, the personal carbon footprint and the offsetting that goes with it was developed by BP and was the subject of a massive marketing campaign by Ogilvy. Now, when I see that, I ask the question, why? And I keep asking that question, and I'll come back to it again in some of our later discussions. This is not to diminish offsetting and carbon footprint measure. We have a couple of companies that we're working with in this field, but proceed cautiously is all I would say in this respect. Now, to go back to the measurement issue, at the macro level, there are also a myriad of approaches from organizations and academic researchers. I'm personally involved in an initiative of the Sustainable Tourism Global Center in Saudi Arabia to create an IPCC equivalent for tourism. We call it the TPCC, the Tourism Panel on Climate Change. And it's designed like the IPCC to provide an independent, science-based perspective on emissions and 1.5 target progress. And we will look certainly at the Glasgow Declaration organizers' positions on these issues, but also the TPCC group will look at IATA's position, ICAO's position, the Airport Council International position. Maybe there'll be an ETC position one day. There's certainly going to be a strong WTTC position who are keen to keep their place in the measurement system framework as they've been there for the past 30 years. The second point of the Glasgow Declaration, the second pathway, is to decarbonize. And here, the declaration decarbonization goals are quite clear and I believe quite credible. It remains to be seen if the EU will tighten further its own targets, and hence the declaration goals will need to be reviewed. And it will be important to see if the sector is capable of transforming fast enough. The Glasgow pathway focuses on net zero carbon 2050. And it's not surprising because it was conceived amidst the general centrist approach that emerged before the Glasgow COP. I repeat again and again and again, the net factor remains a big, big question mark. The passing on of the responsibility to each individual person, in the case of aviation and the CORSIA system, is, in my view, worthy of great discussion. Is it the passengers who are polluting, or is it the provider of the services who are polluting? Is it the passengers who need to compensate, or is it the carriers who need to compensate. And if they then want to charge an additional cost and even make it optional, as the CORSIA, as the current CORSIA situation provides, that's airline marketing and airline pricing. It's not a way, in my view, to ensure that the emissions are actually reduced if the airlines continue to grow and continue to emit, and simply provide for some sort of questionable alternative carbon reduction project somewhere else. It seems to me that they've kind of wriggled out of the responsibility chain. On the one hand, the passenger becomes responsible, and on the other hand, the emissions is not with the polluter. The emissions that are being reduced are emissions that are being created elsewhere. It's a continuing argument. In my personal view, the net factor will be one of those items that disappear in the future, just as we never talk about 2 degrees. Now we talk about 1.5 degrees, but a brief 7 years ago, at the time of the Paris COP and the Paris Agreement, the figure was 2 degrees, and 1.5 was an optional ideal position. The world is moving very quickly in this area. The third pathway is regenerate. This is an admirable aspiration. It ties very much from a rural viewpoint into the nature-based solutions approach. The key question is, could it work in cities? Can you regenerate cities? And can tourism be a regeneration factor? Or does regeneration just become another word like responsible tourism, conscientious tourism, eco-tourism, all of which are subsets of sustainable tourism? The fourth pathway is collaborate. No public position by any body is complete without this. What is interesting is to see how it works in practice. I have personally been to the UNWTO headquarters when we launched Sunex Malta to ask for collaboration from my old colleagues who used to be part of the broad responsibility that I covered in UNWTO. I've asked them to collaborate. I'm waiting to hear from them. And the same thing with the framers of the Glasgow Declaration. We've written to Tourism Declares, to the Travel Foundation, and we've asked, let's collaborate. As I said earlier in these lectures, there is no silver bullet for a code red emergency. Everybody has to put their pieces together. At Sunex Malta, we created our registry so that people would have a place that they could put their sustainability and climate plans and the progress that they make every year, that they commit to make, in plain view for everybody else to see, and particularly for the traveling public to see. Because if the plans are out there, and if they use any one or all of the green badges, it puts the industry in the same position as supermarkets or anybody else. When I go into a supermarket to shop for a bio product, I don't have to know that a particular brand of coffee has reduced its carbon by X% during a year. I just have to know that it's committing, and that by using that label, there's a system out there that it's a part of. And I think I spent a lot of time, and Hans spent a lot of time yesterday, trying to explain the registry in this context particularly, because we believe and we see no reason why people should reinvent the wheel. When we created the registry, we spent over 50,000 euros to construct that database and that web system with the same company who had actually built the UN climate system, because we wanted to get it right. We wanted to make sure that there was a coherent integration between the two systems, so that when anybody registers on the SunX Malta Climate Friendly Travel Registry, automatically they're listed on the broader UN system. And you can imagine how many small red dots there are that you have to dig deeper in. And if the consumer of travel and tourism really wants to see what the hotel has done, we don't have to introduce another complex accounting process for the travel and tourism companies if the consumer has a good way of checking. And we think that the registry provides that purpose. And the registry is not a profit center for SunX Malta. It's a cost center. And we do this, thankfully, because of our relationship with the Malta government and the Malta Tourism Authority. So rant over. The fifth pathway is finance. And it's usual for people to start finance discussions with an estimate of how expensive transformation will be. To throw some unprovable massive figure on the screen, lots of noughts, billions, trillions, and talk about the cost, the higher cost of the alternative of no action. I'd like to suggest you think about a different approach. That one, we think investment, not cost. This is the future of our existence that we're going to be spending money on. It's logical that it's going to be a significant amount because it's a major transformation. And we don't have an alternative if we want to survive. So we say, think investment. And point number two, always keep in mind that we're talking 2030, 2050 targets, but we are running out of time rapidly. If we want to get into this market, we need to get into it now, whether it's with solar panel heating and cooling systems, whether it's with hydrogen, whether it's with electric vehicles, whatever it is, we need to start now. And we need to recognize that we're going to have to take some of the things out of service that we're currently perfectly happy with. Our cars are a good example. There is a stop date in the EU for when you can have a petrol-driven car. So it doesn't matter if you've got a new car, you're not going to be able to operate it, or you're going to have to pay a massive amount. And at some stage, it's just going to stop. And just to set your minds thinking about tomorrow, why can't that happen with airplanes? Why can't airplanes, which no longer meet the correct pollution criteria, simply be taken out of service? we must recognize the need to act now, and that we should have been acting years ago. And now we're going to have a slight change of schedule. We are not going to have the lecture from Felix Dodds today. We've had about an hour already, and if we put Felix's lecture in here, frankly, you'd be sitting here for another hour. And we'll come back and we'll play some of that lecture on another occasion. But for now, I think what we want to do is go straight to the questions and answers and discussion. You know, I've talked a lot today about a long history of tourism's involvement in the quite independent climate response process of the United Nations. We've looked at it for almost 50 years, from the Rio 1992 essentially right through to the present day. And we've taken account of the Paris Agreement, the Davos Declaration, and that's a lot for you guys to absorb. So I think what we're going to do now is we're going to have a discussion period. If you have questions, if you have answers, and I'll try to interact with you to amplify what we've had in the presentation today. Okay, so over to you.